Well, we're here in Brooklyn in general, and in particular, we're here in Clinton Hill. And we're at the Clinton Hill Simply Art and Framing Gallery, and we're with our friend Loretta Brown. Loretta is known to the people in the community that have been here for a while as LB. We all know her as LB. And she's more recently known to some of our new neighbors as the Framing Lady. She's been a constant in this neighborhood since about 1991 or so. Isn't that when you first opened?
Mm-hmm.
And so that means, how many years have you been operating your business?
Well, we're into our 21st year.
Okay. And what about some of the other businesses that were open when you first started?
The businesses that were on Myrtle Avenue were basically your takeout Chinese restaurants, your barbers, your beauty parlors, your liquor stores. There were no real specialty businesses to service the community as it is today. Today, in 2012, is quite different than what it was in 1991. In fact, the location that I am and have been on Myrtle Avenue was really kind of depressed. I mean, there were no businesses other than the local bodega and myself, and many people said she's never going to make it. I wasn't as far down or close to downtown Brooklyn at that time, where you had a lot of them. So to venture, to me, was really a destination. People literally came here to this business, got in their car, and left the block. That's what it was like in 1991. Today it's quite different. They're walking with their dogs, their baby carriages, 2 and 3. They're kind of sauntering up and down Myrtle Avenue. They have reached here. And again, it's still very interesting, because in 1991, I had one fella who was lost, trying to find a BQE. And he came in as if an army was running behind him. He came crashing through the door, and he says, "I can't believe this place. You're like," what did he say? "You're like a gem and an oasis to a lost soul," or something of that nature. "How can I find a BQE? You're the safest place here." And all of this came out at once, and it really shocked me, because I never thought of it in that manner. Today, I have a number of tourists who are traveling through Brooklyn, basically coming from Williamsburg, and then they want to venture into Fort Greene and find the Brooklyn Bridge. They will come in and basically have the same kind of response to this particular business as well as my location. It's like, wow, you know. So
well,
that's nice.
I remember when I first came into your shop, and frankly, it was a Sunday afternoon. I was watching the football game. It was halftime, and I wanted to catch a slice. So I went right next door. It used to be, I think, called Castillo's Pizza at that time.
That was around mid-90s.
Right, and so I went there, and you were open on that Sunday.
Right.
And I came in, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. As a matter of fact, I remember in particular that there was a litho that I was interested in, and I'm very sorry to this day that I never acquired it. But that was my introduction to your shop. Well, let me ask you, okay, I understand that before you went into business, you were an advertising executive for one of our prominent publications in the community. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
When I started in the industry, wonderful. It was a great career. It was grand.
Before we go much further, we should probably mention the name of the publication. As a matter of fact, the founder, I just found him on the United States postage stamp.
That's my last employer. That's John H. Johnson at Ebony Magazine. During that time, it was mid-80s. It was a wonderful time for Ebony, and it was a great time for myself, because during that time, we were targeting the more upscale, affluent black readership of our publication. And our East Coast office, which is where I worked out of, we had 3 offices, one East Coast in Rockefeller Center, and the other one was the home base in Chicago, and the other one was in LA. And on the East Coast, the advertising executives were responsible for regions. And the most interesting thing is that when I came aboard, in fact, there's a lot that I could tell you about Mr. Johnson. He was an incredible human being. He was very personable. He knew all of his managers. My code name, now I can say it, was Big Daddy. And everybody knew that was Chicago, and that was Mr. Johnson. And he did. He treated us almost like a Big Daddy. He spewed words of wisdom, little pearls and gems of what it was like to sell black media, the fact that we were on top. We held our own candle to all of white media. We did everything to give dignity, to draw awareness, to pave the way for other ethnic media. Of course, we had the Power Pack. We had a million or better within a particular demographic. But for me, in particular, it was very interesting because being responsible, I was responsible for a region. And my region was New England and the Caribbean. And that wasn't a bad region, but no one really wanted it. So that's how I kind of inherited it. Well, because the objective was to open up the travel market for middle class and upscale blacks. The reality was blacks were not traveling outside of the United States in any large numbers. It was either business trips or it was maybe a family vacation. And then you really hit the affluent market. But we wanted to open that travel door so other media, well, of course we were leaders, but other media would follow us. And so it was a developmental, and that was where my skills were. Always has been in identifying opportunities, market segments. Specialty was in consumerism, particularly ethnic consumerism, specifically black, once working with Ebony magazine. And so based on the statistics, that was a market that Mr. Johnson wanted developed. So I basically had carte blanche. So the Caribbean there was very interesting because you didn't meet with advertising or marketing directors. You met with the ministers of culture, tourism, and etc. So I was basically around a lot of the government. And then the next was New England. New England, I think you all know this, is where Converse sneakers, Reebok, that was a literally untapped market, considering at that time we were on the upswing in terms of sneaker purchases, yet they weren't visible in any black publications where we had high demographics. And the other was electronics, and that was just at the curve of the boombox. So now we were talking about sophisticated home entertainment units. So for me, it was very exciting because in most instances, people who I met with wanted to know about the black consumer market. They knew Ebony. They didn't know any other media but Ebony. And they really wanted the statistics brought to them. It took a while to develop it, but hence the door was open. I was very proud of a lot of accomplishments that I made personally in the name of Ebony magazine. And it was just a wonderful career. It was a great experience, although I've spoken to some young folks since I've been an entrepreneur in this end of the business. And they tell me that communication business has not changed a great deal in terms of women, in terms of blacks, in terms of other ethnic groups. And that disheartens me because I know that we pioneered and opened a lot of doors for media and for employees in different areas, and we're still not there, and that really that's troublesome, you know? So if you're not doing it on your own, then what happens then?
Well, do for self should be the motto of the day. Now, one thing about Mr. Johnson, I believe that it's true that he was a collector of art, isn't it? Or
well, that's a bit of a myth. Mr. Johnson, he knew a number of artists. Let's kind of flip the page and talk about the 40s, particularly. In the Midwest, you also had who rose to be some of our prominent masters, artists.
like the Aaron Douglases, Augusta Savages. And
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm impressed. But in any event, these were people also who wanted a collector base, and they would go to moneyed individuals. And Mr. Johnson, who, through his staff, he learned a lot through his staff too. He always hired the best. He always had people who knew what they were doing, that were trustworthy and could advise him. So I always say he always hired advisors, and that's what a good business person should be. He used to tell us, never have an employee or anyone around you who will doubt you or tell you you can't do it. Those are the first people you want to get rid of. You never want people to say, I wouldn't do that if I was you, or don't go there, or I remember, get rid of them. And I remember those words to today. But the myth behind it, there's truth, is that these were people who will still do it today. Artists who know folks who have money or who can take their work further, or at least help them out during hard times. And they would sell them the work. And in some instances, artists will sell work and they see the excitement of the collector to acquire it, and they'll say, hey, I'll give this to you if you give me a little bit more money, or I'll give this to you if you do that. And they keep going back, because during the 40s and the 50s, there weren't a lot of people that were approachable like Mr. Johnson was in Chicago. So hence he acquired. And once he bought, again, his building, the land, his building, brought his entire operation into on South Michigan Avenue, he had this repository of black art, and he made sure that this was a form of communication also. So throughout all the floors, black art was hung. And so people in the home office was constantly being exposed to it. They didn't know they had masterpieces underneath their nose. His wife, Mrs. Johnson, was always on the fashion side of it. So it really didn't matter to her until much later in life, when she understood the value of their artwork there. And so that's the kind of fine-tuning.
Well, you know, I mean, I guess throughout Western history at least, people with monies, okay, I guess in Europe perhaps royalties, baronesses, barons, or what have you, were the people that supported the artists, whether they were painters, sculptors, musicians. Absolutely. Okay, and I think it's probably a more recent phenomenon that the middle class collector can actually now acquire some art. So I kind of want to ask you about that. Now, you started by collecting African art, is that correct?
A little story behind that. I am a native New Yorker. I was raised, and all of my schooling, public school through college, in Queens. And during the time that I was a young adult, I guess I had an affinity toward art, because my childhood friends were either veering off into being musically inclined, because I lived in St. Albans, so the Coltrane's were there, if you know what I mean. All of that whole music scene. Even James Brown's house wasn't far from where I lived. So a lot of the fellas were very much involved in the music at that time. And music was in school. You know, music appreciation was in school at that time. So for myself, I appreciated, I've always had an ear for appreciation, and I always see myself as behind the scene kind of person, not the actual talent. There were few who were a part of the visual art movement. At that time it was Black is Beautiful, and so there was a whole cultural revolution going on nationwide. So a very small percentage of my friends were painters, very Afro. We call it Afrocentric now, but at that time, very culturally driven. And I think that's where I had an appreciation. So little Afrocentric shops in the neighborhood would pop up, and I would go to them. And I distinctly remember it was in the early to mid 70s. I purchased my first original art. And
you mind telling us what you bought?
I will tell you what I bought. And this was the cat's meow. It was black velvet. It was and at that time, that was, I mean, buying a painting on black velvet, and it was original, please, that was it. And mine was not the little 16 by 20.
Oh no, these were large works.
Right, exactly.
Oh, I remember them very well. I think that younger people today, might not have a clue as to what we're talking about.
I know, it's highly collectible right now. And I'll tell you how that kind of changed. But that was my first one. It was a large one. It was about 30 by 40. I still have it, by the way. Yes, I still have it. And I'll tell you an interesting story about that, too. So I bought that, and some of my friends started admiring it because no one really thought about buying art. It was the jewelry, it was the dashiki, so it was the modeling and the fabrics and the making of that. And then it was the musicians, you know, who's going to be the next Coltrane to come out of here, you know, that kind of thing. And it kind of stuck with me. So as I started to, mature, I started buying different artifacts, art, carvings, and etc. But I wasn't really exposed to a lot of the paintings because it wasn't really in Queens coming out like it was in Harlem or maybe in Chicago or maybe on the West Coast. But once I started in a profession, then I was exposed to people like Romare Beard, and that was earlier on when I was working at Black Enterprise. And I had such a fascination with his work, but he was like any other person there. He wasn't the Romare Beard and that many people knew. And there were two others that I have since deceased and were brilliant artists and reached some type of prominence in, but not like Bearded.
Oh, who are those?
One is called George. I remember him very well. He passed on. He kind of apprenticed under and worked at the same time with Romare. And there's another one called Ed Towles. Ed later moved to Baltimore. Brilliant artists who at that time either got commissions to work on magazine covers or the graphics. That was to pay a salary. Their highly evolved creative style and experimental style was something they did on the side. But because we were all exposed to them, we saw them, we talked, we did those things. So my eye became refined at Black Enterprise magazine, and I started actively collecting and supporting the arts once I started, just before I went to Ebony. I think it kind of picked up because I was exposed now to the Caribbean and having to meet and present to the ministers of culture and tourism. It allowed me to see the culture of those island nations and who their masters were and who their influences was. And
well, how did you move from being a collector to someone that sold black art? And what type of art did you start out? Did you sell reproductions or original works, or how did you get started doing that?
Well, in the 70s, we were talking about the 70s. Then we're talking about the 80s that I had a career that allowed me to purchase serious artwork, not just black art. That was my main focus. There wasn't a lot. And I do want to stop right here and say something too. During the time of the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of protesting going on. And there were a lot of cities with high black populations that were just unhappy with the economic climate, the cultural climate, and etc. The things that were lost were the paintings. They were either destroyed or lost through fires, or artists who were moving or dying or what have you. Because paintings are very fragile. The reality is they're quite fragile. So there was a gap of African-produced art. That's why it's so valuable now if you can acquire through, family or however you acquire it, as well as the black velvet paintings. So now we're talking about the early 90s. I'm in a career, and I started to look at statistics, and I realized there are two things going on. The projection of middle income, upscale, particularly the African American or the black consumer market, was buying homes. The economy was looking pretty good for them. They were buying homes, they were doing more home entertainment, they were becoming more affluent. They wanted their culture around them, and the last frontier was paintings. And on the other hand, when I looked at the statistics, I found that reproductions of living and past African Americans in particular were just not in existence. There was just not a business that was publishing or representing. There were businesses that would get the masters, but they would get it through museums who had shows, who actually produced a poster from the show. That was one. Or the other, from your cultural festivals, African street festivals, for instance, is a great one here in Brooklyn that started. Any kind of cultural festivals, it was the artists who dug in their pocket, who found a printer friend, who printed X amount for them, and they were the distributor, the seller, and the creator, but only at those festivals or street fairs. And I said, this is outrageous, because I just naturally assumed there were businesses and there was publishing where one could go in and buy reproductions of living artists' work, because if they couldn't own it or couldn't find it, you sell an original, hence a reproduction. And so when I saw that, I thought of the future, because that's what I do. And I just thought this was outrageous. When I started asking a couple of friends, when was the last time you bought a poster produced by XYZ or by a black artist? Oh, I don't know, I was at some festival or another, you know, when I was down at the jazz festival or whatever, you know, doing these things. And I looked around in New York. There were really no frame shops or art galleries that specialized in works on paper. Voila. And that's how Clinton Hill Simply Art got started. I started the business by talking to a few of the more prominent art publishers, and I asked them, why aren't you producing, or why aren't you negotiating the reproduction of prints by African American, Caribbean, or Latin American artists? And they said, well, there's no outlet, there's no real market for them. And there was one guy who's still in my life now. I remember day one, that was in 1990. I went to him, very prominent guy, and he said, you know something, you're on to something. He was the premier art publisher and distributor of all African masters through the Smithsonian. And he said he has slowly watched his business uptick, but he doesn't have an outlet, a retail outlet to sell to. And that's when I had the confidence to say there's more than just myself that see an opportunity. And you know, I decided to specialize in ethnic art on paper, African American, Caribbean American, Latin American, and Native American. And I bought across the country anything that was produced by them or those images. And that's how this business started. 90% of all of my sales was ethnic art on paper, and about 10% or less was custom framing. And that was in the 1990s.
Now, of course, everything changes over time. I remember when Clinton Hill and Fort Greene, those of us of African descent who lived here, we defined this neighborhood as the Boga line. We had signs up, and you could go up and down Fulton Street, Myrtle Avenue, what have you, and signs inside of some of the shops that were owned by African American proprietors. But the economy changed.
Right.
I guess September 11th happened. Gentrification certainly happened. And so how did that impact, if it did impact, on the business that you have now? And I'll just say that my own personal observation is I recall in years past you had a lot of racks of large poster art for sale,
right,
and that sort of thing. And I've watched you evolve to focus more on framing. So how did that happen?
Well, you know, anyone that's in business, your business will go through a life cycle. And if you don't keep up with that life cycle, besides other business situations that one may incur, you will probably go out of business. So for me, the attraction was a void in the market and the projection that it needs to be filled, and who's going to fill it. And I started, but I was not a distributor, I was not a publisher, and there wasn't an extension to my business. That's one thought. The other is with regard to changing, watching the neighborhood change. I also watch my target market mature. In between the prints and the posters, there were people who wanted limited editions. And once they bought limited editions and understood the intrinsic value of a limited edition, they also became hungry for original work by artists that they could afford, that they felt 10, 20 years from now they would have something that's marketable. Understanding buying original work or limited edition is a part of personal asset. It is just as much as valued as land or stock. That was a mature market. So I did have another level of business extension, and because that market started telling me I want to see more. So I created an opportunity where some of the living young artists in the early 90s, say from 91 to 95, who had no outlet, it wasn't like it is today. I mean, people like Danny Simmons. Danny Simmons made a comment. He says, well, people don't know that before that there was a Mikado, before there was a Corridor Gallery, there was a you who gave us an opportunity. Then any African American artist, male or female, living in the Brooklyn or living in the Manhattan area came through this gallery to sell their originals.
I remember seeing, I guess I was introduced to the work of Brian Collier, who's one of my favorites, through stuff that you had here in your shop. And as a matter of fact, there's kind of an extensive list of artists who presented work through you, or that whose work you've sold in your shop. And I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. But some of my favorites that I see here, William Tolliver, for sure. People like Cheryl Miller, Celeste Morris, Otto Niels, Verna Hart, whose work I love, Eli Kent's, okay, whose work I also love, and just a large number of Kwame Braithwaite, you know, and people like that, and Ron Campbell, and you know, some of the you had photographers as well as you know, painters. You had Chester Higgins' work and so on and so forth. So it's almost like a who's who of African American contemporary art, who you know, whose stuff you could find here. But what I want to ask you is, now that the neighborhood has changed, what caused you to focus more on the framing side as opposed
Well,
to...
you know, the evolution was from the art side. As I said, I started following the market, so of course it said I want to see more original work, and I followed that. And then of course there were things that one inherited. They just, the best laid out plans. Who knew 9/11 would happen? Who knew our economy would take such a serious slump? Who knew our neighborhood would make such a rapid change? These are the things that had me twisted and turning and refining constantly. And I did it with the idea of watching, I think it was the late 90s. Because now you think, from when I started up to the mid-90s, there became a proliferation of ethnic works on paper. Some of your better artists found just that middle-class market was buying, upscale market was buying their work at various festivals and shows, that they came out with limited edition. When you have a limited edition print, you have to treat it differently in terms of framing it than you would a poster, an ordinary poster. When you have original painting that has value and you want to maintain the value, you frame that differently. So with that in mind, I started to slowly expand the samples for framing, and I would hire framers to come in, because it was told to me by one businessman that I absolutely appreciate, who was in the business, who did not feel intimidated by me at all. And he said, listen, you're doing great. You're selling original work, you're selling prints and posters. They started taking in prints and posters. Then you had art publishers popping up all across the U.S., West Coast, East Coast, taking in their regional African American painters, you know, Latin painters. He said, don't lose the customer. Offer them a secondary service, and that's custom picture framing. And I said, I don't know anything about framing. I know art. And he says, you don't have to, you hire people. And it took me back to Mr. Johnson's days. There are things that you can't do. You understand how to hire them to do the work on your behalf. And I said, oh, eureka. So around the mid-90s to the late 90s, I was managing the framing end of the business, and I was helping identify the quality of art and then identify the type of framing.
Let me just stop you right there. All art deserves frames, deserves to be framed. But how do you decide what type of frame and what type of matting would best, display the piece of art? I mean, I'm sure it sounds to me as though there's an art to making that sort of selection.
Well, yeah, and that comes from, let me just use this as an analogy of how I got in it and tapped the creative vein. Remember, I had the marketing experience and expertise there. I had the personal experience and expertise there, and the entrepreneurial end of it. Now, the physicality of framing I didn't have, but I had a greater appreciation once I got involved with it, because what you're really asking me is what the average consumer comes to a framer for, because they feel helpless. Like, how do I do this? How does this work? And why does it cost so much? Well, when you peel back the layers of framing, it's like any other area that can generate a revenue. They're different layers, just like cars. You got an Isuzu and you got a Lexus. They both take you to point A and point B on wheels. They both start up the same. It's the same thing with custom picture framing. You've got to be able to match the art to the framing. For me, I look at it from structure. Picture framing is not about a pretty something to enhance the artwork. It's the house in which your investment rests. So if you will spend money on an original piece of artwork, the bonus for you is the decorative end. That seems to be the first attraction to most buyers, is make it look good. Well, what does that mean? Because it's custom. And I found another voice, because the majority of people in the early, say 2000, right after World Trade Center, had shifted. Remember that ethnic market, that upscale, first time buying custom picture framing or knowing I need custom picture framing? They weren't bringing in artwork or asking about prints and posters by Romare Bearden or Jacob Lawrence or Vincent Smith or on and on. Or I went to this professional organization's convention and I bought a original Eli Kent's or Leroy
Campbell.
Thank you, Leroy Campbell. They would come back and say, I think I need to reframe this because I have drapes that are this color, and I just had carpet laid and I have this leather couch, and
the wall is painted this color.
Yes, exactly. And I said, geez, these folks don't get it. They don't get it. So that's when the educational part came in. I said, now I got to break this down. Original artwork is not treated like wall art. It should hold its own wherever you go in your life and wherever it goes. It will blend in. Now, if you want something to match your drapes, you need to buy lesser valued artwork and get your color scheme.
You know what you do? You go to the thing that you see on TV, the starving artists, where you get an oil painting original for $50 or something like that.
Exactly, exactly.
And it'll match your sofa that you just bought from, Raymore and Flanagan.
Exactly, exactly. And so I felt, oh, wait a minute, these folks really need someone to help them along here. And what happened to me as being a business owner, I have always, back to Mr. Johnson's voice, every business, every occupation has a trade convention, and it has a trade organization of which standards and procedures are set forth. Always be a part of that, because you'll always be ahead of the general public. And I remember that. And that's why he would always let us go to wherever we wanted to go. I mean, I used to go to Vegas like people every year for the Consumer Electronics Show because I handle electronics. So I love the conventions. I worked them. And once I got involved with our industry conventions, I was like, oh, here she comes again. One woman, female owner. That's pretty much unheard of as 100% ownership. And oh, forget it, black. She's not working out of a garage. My goodness, she's got brick and mortar. So, I mean, it was a very interesting situation, one that was not unusual for me. So I think once they felt comfortable, they meaning manufacturing reps, all type of industry people there, as well as people who I was their client, it became us and not her and me, because I was accustomed to that. So I had to make them feel easy and not with all the airs, yes, I'm the owner. You know, it's like, hey, tell me about this. And once I got involved, I started taking nothing but workshops, understanding what woods were about, what finishes were about, what artwork should be placed in what. And before I knew it, the art end came together with the framing end. And now I'm prepared, as we get into the teens of 2000, to introduce the fine art of custom picture framing, how to buy it, industry secrets and trades, because I don't care what color you are. There are a lot of people that don't understand the industry of custom picture framing. And that's becoming very important now, because people still have personal items that need to be framed appropriately. And they're running around with their heads cut off because they don't know where to go, because people like this business, independently owned custom frame shops, are closing. So for me, I said, here comes another opportunity, because now the Kmarts, the Walmarts, the Ikeas, they're selling black art all up online. I mean, you know, any place you look, you can find ethnic art.
But you
don't
still
need
have
me.
to get it framed.
Thank you.
You know what? This almost brings us full circle, and it's maybe a good place for us to end. But here's my observation. Ebony magazine is completely different now than when Mr. Johnson founded it. Back in the good old days, and younger people probably wouldn't know this, but there was a magazine called Life magazine, and it was very popular.
Right.
And Ebony was almost like the black version, or the Negro, you know, version of Life magazine. And one of the things that Ebony magazine used to do all the time was they would write about Negro firsts. The first African American person to do this or to do that. The first one to become a general in the military. The first one to... And so the reason it seems to me that we've virtually come full circle is that if that were the focus of Ebony magazine today, they would almost have to do a feature on you, because you are a first. There's nobody doing what you do.
Well,
and you can afford to be modest if you wish, but this is the reality, okay? This shop is unique, and what you do is unique, and what you bring to the community is something unique and very, very special. And those of us who've been in the community for a while, we really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
well, thank you.
And thank you for sharing time with us.
My pleasure. I'd like to say one thing
Please.
that I missed. With the framing in, I have taken framing as a language. And this is what I find so exciting for me, that language, sometimes we think of it as a foreign tongue, and it really is. But when it comes to the framing part, unlike the art part is a learned, intelligent part. The framing is an emotional part in which one has to articulate what I like and I don't like. And I have found a way that people, it doesn't matter what color, it doesn't matter what age group, it doesn't matter what gender, which means I have a pretty mixed clientele now. When I can ask them questions about their lifestyle, most of them fit my demographics. They're upscale, some are wealthy, some are business owners, professionals, etc., living here in the neighborhood. So The language is a bit different, but once they're truthful with what color they like, what their home looks like, because I could go in there and rip them off, you know, once they tell me all the stuff they have their home. Then I start to lay out different periods. Like I can do a Victorian, I can do a modern, I can do a rustic look, and it still pulls a different feeling. And they love it because they feel that with custom they have participated as a part of being so helpless. And that has helped me so much in finding my voice, because that's something that comes from within. So I feel that when it's all said and done, I didn't choose this business at all. It chose me. And I'm still growing with it. And that's what I love about it. So come and see me.
And let us know where we can find you.
Okay. Well, oh yeah, listen, if you want to know anything that I'm doing behind the scenes, latest sales, latest tips, latest hints, and some of my little stories, I have a blog spot. It's called clintonhillframe.blogspot.com. And it's an unusual one because you can ask me questions. I'm starting for the month of March to Ask Framing Lady, which has now become my another nickname, and I'll talk to you about any ideas that you may have about how to, or you need to know about hanging artwork, about buying artwork with frame, without frame, and the options open to you. And currently I have one about my experience meeting Whitney Houston. So I try to tie in my past career experience with something that is highly collectible. I made a mention there that the first thing a collector does when you find someone that you're intrigued with, or someone you think has talent, or if you think a future, or someone you admire, get their autograph, and then bring it to me and frame it.
Exactly, instead of putting it on eBay.
Right. So we're located at 583 Myrtle Avenue in Brooklyn, Clinton Hill section. And you'll find me here until I'm not here.